And sometimes God doesn't take away the fire, does he? Well, we got to trust him. I know it's difficult. We got to trust him when we're in the fire. Let's talk about that. 3 things. What happens when we trust God in the fire? Number 1, even though God may not take the fire away, you know what? He's going to walk through the fire with us. He's there with us. In verses 24 and 25, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in alarm. He said to his advisors, "Didn't we throw 3 men bound into the fire?" "Yes, of course, your majesty," they replied to the king. He exclaimed, "Look, I see 4 men, not tied, walking," can you see this in your head? "Walking around in the fire unharmed." All right, if I'm still alive in the fire, I'm jumping out of there, right? These guys are just walking around in the fire. This is a comical scene to me. I don't know why, but it kind of seems funny to me. They're just walking around in the fire. The 4th, he says, looks like a son of the gods. God said, folks, listen. God said, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." Jesus said, last words before he left this earth, Jesus said, and remember this, "I am always with you to the very end of the age." Some of you need to memorize Psalm 46:1. It's a really good passage to remember. Some of you may need to hear this passage today and just put it in your heart, reflect on it, chew on it. But it says, God is our refuge and strength, a helper who is always found in times of trouble. Your translation might say an ever-present help. You need to circle that, ever-present. He's always, circle that word always. He is always with you. God is always with you. And when the heat is on, I know it's difficult sometimes to feel his presence and to know he's there. And sometimes we question, is God in this right now with me? Is he really? It's when the heat is on, in times of trouble, it says there in the Psalm, he's closer than you're thinking or feeling in that moment. He is always with you, and he goes through the fire with you. He is there. Number 2, God can help us come out intact. God can help us come out intact. In verse 26, Nebuchadnezzar approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire, and he called, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, stop walking around in the fire. Come out." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. Verse 27, when the satraps, prefects, governors, and the king's advisors gathered around, I imagine they're going, "Oh my goodness, this is amazing." When they saw that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, not a hair of their heads was singed, their robes were unaffected, and there was no smell of fire on them. Could you imagine that? Going through a fire and going, "I don't even smell like it. No smoke." Really? That's amazing. God was on their side. And he made sure that they came out of the furnace unharmed and unaffected. I'm not saying it's going to happen every time we go through the fire, but God has the power to take care of us. He's on our side. And when we go through difficulties in this life, he is able to protect our well-being, as traumatic as those times can be, but he can protect our well-being. There may be a lesson for us to learn in that ordeal. There may be a characteristic in our life that needs to be strengthened or straightened out in that ordeal. But here's what I think the best thing that happens in these fiery ordeals in our lives. Here's the best thing I think that happens, and that is we draw closer to God. You think about when you go through a fiery ordeal, what happens? Man, you're praying more, you're reading your Bible more, you're showing up at church and going, "Okay, I need other people to pray for me." You're just so in tune with God. And what happens? You are drawing closer to God. And James tells us when we draw close to God, he draws close to us. So in those fiery ordeals, trust God. He can help you come out intact. Number 3, it causes unbelievers to come to God. Unbelievers can come to know God by going through the ordeal. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, he's impressed. In verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar exclaimed, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel and rescued his servants who trusted in him. They violated the king's command," he says, and risked their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. They trusted in God. And their loyalty to God, this is the second time I think, turns Nebuchadnezzar's attention to God. You would think he would get it by now. But let me say this, how you handle pain and sorrow and traumatic events, how much you trust God through your pain and when you're under pressure, when the heat is on in your life, will most likely could be your most powerful witness and testimony in your life. That God can use that to show others to come to him. When the heat gets turned up in your life, I pray that you'll stand up under the pressure and that you'll stand up for God, because when you do that, people take notice and your actions could lead someone to Jesus Christ. I also want to share this. There's a neat lesson from botany I want to share with you here. This is really cool. Some of you know this, but in the northern United States and Canada, there is a tree, an evergreen that grows. It's called the jack pine tree. Some of you may know this, but the main way the jack pine cone tree reproduces is through forest fires. This is kind of neat. There is a resin on the pine cone itself that makes it nearly impossible for the seeds to just pop out on their own. Makes it too tight. And so under fire and intense heat, the resin melts off of the cone and the seeds are able to drop out onto the ground, and then they germinate to create new generations of jack pine trees. It's kind of neat. They grow only after they've been through the fire. Folks, some of the greatest things that can happen in our life are going to come out of the fires in our own lives. I know you're feeling the heat. It's tough. It's a lot of pressure. But man, trust God, because something good can come out of it. What happens in the rest of the story? We'll talk about that and we'll close up. Daniel chapter 3, verse 29. Nebuchadnezzar says, "Therefore I issue a decree that anyone of any people, nation, or language who says anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb, and his house made a garbage dump." That was like their go-to thing, right? He says, there is no other God who is able to deliver like this. Man, could we say that? We get through the fire and say, there is no other God who is able to deliver like this. I'm praying it happens in your life. Then the king rewarded Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Again, these guys remain loyal to God, and what happens? They get rewarded. Again, I'm not saying it's going to happen. Every time you stay loyal to God, God's going to, lavish rewards on you. I'm not a health and wealth gospel preacher, okay? I'm not a prosperity guy. But man, when you stay loyal to God, good things happen. God sees that and we're rewarded. We know one day we will be rewarded with many great rewards when we get to heaven based on the works that we've done here on earth. I look forward to that day, right? Some of us are going to I hope it's not the case for anybody here or watching online, but some of us may make it to heaven by the skin of our teeth. Please don't make it that way. Man, let your faith show and by your actions, and let it be that others of us who make it to heaven, we're going to pass with flying colors and receive incredible rewards. So let me ask you this. How are you investing your Christian life? I mean, really, do you take it seriously? Are you remaining loyal to God? Are you pointing others to Jesus? Do you serve others with the love of Jesus in your heart? Do you make a daily investment in your life and in God by spending time with him every day in Bible reading and prayer? Are you making worship services on Sunday mornings a priority in your life to come and hear what God has to say for you? Are you standing up for Jesus? Are you living it day in and day out? That's the question, because if you are, good things are going to happen. When we get to heaven, man, I would love to see all of you standing in line when God is handing out rewards for the things that we've done. I'd love to see God handing all of our member partners at Hilliard Church of Christ excellent rewards for what we've done. I hope to see that. How do you get them? Trust God in the fire. Trust God in the fire. Do life God's way. Care more about what God says than what everyone else says, what this world says. And when you remain loyal to God through the fires in your life, you will reap some of the greatest rewards. Stay strong. It's tough, I know.